This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Nita Farahany, and I have to tell you, this is one of those conversations that I did not expect to exactly have. We've got all kinds of problems with liberty right now, but did you know we might have a coming problem of cognitive liberty? That's right. They're coming for what's in your mind, not just what you can see. They're coming for your thoughts, your feelings, your imagination, and they might try to regulate it. They might try to censor it. They might try to control it. I always enjoy these conversations. I always enjoy this podcast. Without any further delay, let's jump right in today and discuss the battle for your brain with Nita Farahany. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I would have to say that in going through your world and thinking about the topic we're going to talk about today, even though you don't sound depressing or frightening, this is one depressing and frightening topic in a way. It's not exactly fun.
It could be. The downsides of technology, and especially this one, are not fun. The downsides of this really are very dystopian, but the upsides are also incredibly promising.
But hold on, I'm not going to let you go there yet. I want to step back for a second.
I just wanted to frame it as we don't have to start with depression.
Yeah, well, you've got me. I'm wondering how a professor of law is still talking about liberty in America in 2023. It seems like so many of the tenets of liberty that we might have all grown up with have changed a lot in the last handful of years. Fair assessment?
No, that's very true. That's a big reason why I've been motivated to write this book is I don't think we have been thinking holistically about what the concept of liberty means, not just in America, but generally in the digital age. We have all of these old, now deceased philosophers who wrote these great tomes on what liberty meant, but it's what liberty meant in a very different world.
That's an interesting statement. And I should say to you, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I happen to reside in Saigon, Vietnam. And I like to think, after being here for quite a while, that I have quite a bit of liberty, which would probably cause many Americans' heads to explode.
Why would it cause their heads to explode? Because they would expect that you don't have liberty there, or because they don't have liberty?
I think because they might think of the form of government or this or that, and they would think, no, America's number one. We have all this liberty.
No, that's true. And I think there is this idea that the place where there is the greatest flourishing for liberty is in the United States, but I'm not sure that that's true anymore.
I want to discuss with you just at the beginning, just the concepts of liberty sum and where we stand. And then we can get into, oh my gosh, the liberty of our minds, our cognitive liberty. My gosh, right when you think you've wrapped your arms around where we are, you're delightfully taking us on another adventure. I've had a blog up probably since the late 90s, even before there was blogs. I've had a podcast up for over 10 years. I've written a bunch of books. I did a documentary film. I've never had anybody censor me. And I'm not a flamethrower, but last year, the year before, on Facebook, I linked to a CDC report directly to the CDC, directly to a PDF on the CDC website. And Mr. Zuckerberg decided that that was not appropriate, and I got suspended. And I thought to myself, why am I playing this game? Why am I even here? And at that moment, I said, well, gosh, I'll still post my podcast on Facebook, whatever, but I don't want to participate anymore. Roll forward a year, I'm watching what's unfolding with Twitter and watching what's unfolding with Matt Taibbi and some of the other journalists, and finding out that so many of these government agencies have been sending these requests to all the social media places. So we know what's happened with Twitter. Okay, I assume it's happening with everybody. At that moment, I said to myself, God, what are we in the middle of? What is this all? I'm just one person, but I can imagine it's affecting everybody. Some people know, some people don't know. As a professor of law with a keen focus on liberty, what do you take about where we have moved to in the last handful of years? It doesn't feel promising to me.
I'll say first that the public square has changed a lot. Where you would go to protest or comment or say anything back in the old days is very different than where you would go now. The very fact that you feel censored by not being on Facebook or by being taken down on Facebook.
Let me clarify. It's not a feeling of censored. It was censored.
Well, it's censored in a particular spot, which is on a public company's website, on their social media platforms, as opposed to nothing would stop you still from going out in the street and protesting or commenting. But the amplification of your voice is significantly censored when the platforms that we now connect by and communicate by are able to censor you. So I just point that out to say where people protest, where people comment, and where people share their public commentary from back in the days of John Stuart Mill until now are vastly different. Censorship and government censorship is much more insidious because it can go after you not in the public square where you're protesting, but in these public forums that are not quite public forums. They're still companies. So it's a very different world that we live in. And we haven't updated our concept of liberty despite that, despite the fact that fundamentally your censorship now is censorship on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or TikTok or any other place that is not where we used to be able to communicate and had very different rules that regulated them. We're in a world of great censorship now, but it's a world that the censorship isn't even necessarily directly seen because you don't know if it was the government who censored you or Mark Zuckerberg who censored you, who did it.
We do now know after the release of all these files on Twitter that the federal government especially has been picking and choosing who they want to.
No, that's right. But the question is for your case, who did it? You could sue to try to get to the bottom of it and find out, was that government censorship of your speech or not?
I guess what I'm setting up is now that we've got this incestuous system of the so-called public companies and the government that is now directing the public companies to take action, the public companies are the public square that you just alluded to. Because once the government is involved with a public company and directing the public company what to do, where are we? It's a distinction without a difference to me.
I agree with you, but sometimes it's not going to be the government who is doing it. So the idea that the government is sometimes stepping in doesn't, I think, make every action by the company government action. If you're arguing that they're intermingled because the government sometimes steps in and censors some people and sometimes doesn't, I think it still matters who they're censoring and who they aren't for who has a claim or a cause of action against them. It's both. It's both the company taking action to censor people individually, and then it is the government making choices as well. I don't think the fact that they sometimes pick and choose means that every action of the company then becomes attributable to the government.
I'm not sure how I feel about that because I feel like once the government is involved with operating inside these public companies to censor people's speech, and then there's no action that's taking place, as far as I know, nobody is really attempting to go down this rabbit hole. Then they've always got this plausible deniability. Well, we just suggested something. We pointed out something. We didn't tell them to take something down. And this gets to the ethical part of all this, is it feels like to me, if we've got a set of rules as a society, if we're trying to do an end around on the rules and we're trying to massage every corner, eventually, what are we left with?
That's a bigger, deeper existential question.
Well, you're a good lady to throw that to, aren't you?
I am. And I'd say if we want to get to the heart of why I wrote the book, The Battle for Your Brain, it really is this question of what will we be left with, not just from government intervention or action, but a world in which we fully embrace all of these digital technologies at the cost of human flourishing. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be at the cost of human flourishing, but a lot of the technologies that we're integrating into our everyday lives, a lot of what the digital age has become, hasn't been focused on how to actually increase liberty or increase human flourishing. It's been how to maximize the rate of technological development or maximize the rate of profits for companies without thinking about the impact on humanity. I'm inviting us to step back and to define what the liberty interest is that we most care about in the digital age, which is cognitive liberty and how it has been vastly compromised. And so if you think about your own ability to speak on Facebook, and your ability to express your views, that's our classic freedom of speech. I'm getting at much more fundamentally, even your freedom of thought, your ability to think freely.
And you're going down the rabbit hole that's going to scare the bejesus out of people.
It's really to point out this idea of Yeah, everybody is talking about censorship of speech and censorship of views and cancel culture and banning books and that's all terrible and terrifying, and the idea that we no longer have a society in which people can freely exchange ideas and do so without either being shut down, shot down, or canceled is already, I think, a tragedy for what it means to be human. But it's going to get a lot worse if we don't even have a space to think freely.
Before we get to the worst part, what you just said, you can't really turn on any kind of major media and hear what you just said. You're at Duke, a fine institution, been around for a long time. But why is it that what you just said, it's like there's an entire, I almost want to call it an operation, where what you just said is not at the forefront of discussion. And rather, people are just kept in a state of angst or anger or fear or some type of emotional situation.
Well, because people are being censored. I happen to be fortunate to be in a position of a chaired professorship at a university where it's difficult to cancel me or fully cancel me.
Are there people that want to cancel you?
Not yet. Maybe after our podcast today, they will. Not yet. I think people are willing to hear what I have to say and they're engaging with it. But I think most professors, if you talk to them individually, not on the record, they'll tell you that they're scared of saying almost anything publicly these days because of walking into a minefield and not even realizing that they're doing so, which could lead to significant calls for canceling them or firing them or saying that they are any number of words you want to pick that describe that their views are not adhering to what a mainstream or an emerging view is about sensitivity for particular topics. And I think if we go back to the concepts of liberty back in John Stuart Mill talking about freedom of thought, and we talk about that and think about that, which is the inability to hear different viewpoints is a way to ensure that the truth doesn't emerge, that people don't actually develop the ability to think freely, to discover their own self-identity, to discover truth. And we are silencing so many voices to prevent those kinds of conversations. Or if you look at the nature of public discourse, which is completely broken down, I think we're at a moment in society where we're really losing the fundamental ability for people to think, discuss, and participate freely in ways that are critical to liberty.
Did you see the judge that came to Stanford Law School and was shouted down and could not participate?
I did. That one I will say I was not as impressed with. There have been a number of these examples that I've been more shocked with, but that one seems like more of a setup, to be honest, which is he went in expecting protest with his camera ready to go, shouting things at the students. There were aspects of it that did not leave me impressed.
I don't know the details, but if I think back in the last 20 to 30 years, just can't imagine if a professor of law or a judge came to a law school like Stanford and was going to speak. Okay, maybe some people aren't happy, but the whole idea, like what you just described, is the interchange of ideas. So it really doesn't make a difference what his intentions were, from my humble opinion. If he showed up and he was, flamethrower, okay, but still, he can come and he can speak, and the students can question, and there can be vigorous back and forth. But this generation right now of shouting down, I can put myself in the shoes or try to imagine the shoes of professors right now in 2023. And as you just laid out, it's got to be a worrisome feeling that if you say the wrong thing, who's got your back, so to speak?
I agree with you. So we won't get into the specifics of that case. Both sides, I think, are at fault in that particular case of it going poorly. I do think people have a right to counter speech. And I think that Stanford's attempt to try to say where counter speech can occur, if you want to protest outside the classroom so that somebody can continue to speak inside the classroom, if you want to vigorously question somebody inside the classroom, but allow them to continue their speech, those all seem like good approaches to allowing a diversity of viewpoints to be heard. Shouting somebody down so that they can't be heard, that doesn't seem like a good idea. I don't think that's quite what happened at the Stanford case, but some of them have been just like that. For me, I teach criminal law, and it's a fraught topic. Walking into the classroom, I worry about every one of the conversations that I have to have in that class, from discussions of rape to discussions of homicide to police use of force. There are so many triggering topics in that class, and it's so easy to get it wrong as a modern day professor talking about those topics. Even if I taught the material exactly the same way that I did a decade ago, the students, where they are, how they think about it, have changed a lot too. And so I do often feel like I'm walking on eggshells when I walk into the classroom.
Let me ask you, because I'm not there. So, for example, you're teaching criminal law, topic of homicide comes up. Okay, I'm assuming there's probably diverse type class. What is causing homicide, murder? These are not nice things, and there's all kinds of legal definitions for the type of homicide. But what is one of the big things that students today are getting worked up about that would not have gotten worked up about 10 years ago?
It's smaller and bigger things. So on homicide, suppose you bring in, instead of just what's in the textbook, modern day examples, or you're pointing out, for example, that a police lineup was biased. And so the eyewitness testimony in that particular case was problematic. And suppose you put up a lineup that shows images of all African American males between the age of 25 and 35 or something. The very fact that what you're showing are images primarily of African American males in that example, as opposed to a more diverse lineup, or showing examples from different racial and ethnic backgrounds of lineups, would, I think, lead some students to say you're showing only a perspective which suggests that African American males are more likely to commit crimes or something like that. You have to be very careful about what examples you use so that you're not using a particular, even if there's overrepresentation right now in the criminal justice system of African American males, your examples in the classroom have to carefully not suggest any kind of racial bias in what you're displaying. Or a different example, not quite a homicide example, would be I often started with the trolley problem in class. And the trolley problem has many different variations to it. Are you familiar with the trolley problem?
I'm not.
So the trolley problem is a classic philosophical problem of, it starts with you're a bystander and you walk upon a trolley that's out of control. And the trolley that's out of control is about to hit 5 people who are tied to the tracks ahead. There is a switch that you can pull, and it would divert the track to a different track where there's one person tied to the track. There's no other option. There's nothing else you can do. It's either you pull the lever or you do nothing at all. If you do nothing at all, the trolley's out of control. It will kill those 5 people. If you pull the lever, it will divert it, but it will kill that one other person. What do you do? And many students, if not most of them, for that first iteration of the trolley problem, well, actually, before I tell you, what would you do? You're the bystander. What are you going to do?
If I'm understanding it correctly, I try to imagine myself as the leader of a country. You try to save the most people possible.
But you're not a leader of the country. You are just you.
Well, but that's how I think of myself.
Okay.
I would think of myself, how would a leader of a country think? So my decision making would be, how do I save the most people possible?
Okay. So you would pull the lever.
Yeah.
Okay. So then there are a lot of iterations of this. And one of the iterations of it are, you are now standing on a bridge above the tracks, and there is a very large, overweight man standing in front of you who, based on a quick calculation in your head, you realize you could push over the bridge and that person would fall on the tracks below. It would stop the oncoming train from killing the 5 people. Do you push that person over the bridge?
From a fallacy standpoint, it's a very different question.
Why is it a very different question?
No, they're very different, because in the first situation, you've got a choice of, okay, one person dies, or is it 4 or 5 people die? So you can make a decision like that. The next situation is, you are now choosing to kill somebody.
Well, you did in the first instance too, because that one person wasn't going to die until you pulled the lever.
It's a fascinating example.
Okay, so now I give this example to you. I start class often the first day of class.
It doesn't offend me, though. It's very interesting.
Well, no, let me tell you the part that offends. I do this because we're talking in the first day of class about utilitarianism and retributivism and different theories of punishment, and why does the criminal justice system do what it does. In that example, there's many iterations of it, but that one, pushing the person over the bridge, is one of the examples of it, which has been used in philosophy for a very long time. There are images of it, and there's been neuroimaging studies done to try to understand why people come out differently, because just like you were just struggling between the two examples, students struggle. It goes on to a doctor harvesting the organs of one person to save five. There's many iterations of it. The example of using the larger obese person is now triggering in a way it wasn't 5 years ago for students. It depends on how you describe that person. If you use the word fat or obese, or it's ableist or a different perspective. And the students of today, depending on whether you use that example, what images you use for that example, or what language you use to describe that example, react to that in a much more triggering and different way than they reacted 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago. Nobody would have even remarked on it 10 years ago. And the students of today, a number of them do. It's little things like that which have fundamentally changed how professors teach and how they think about teaching and how students react, is the subtleties in just how you frame that question, how you describe the person, whether you use the example and what examples you can use. You don't always know where the minefields are. You use an example you've used in the past.
Given your background, given the class you're teaching, with something interesting when you were bringing up the crime statistics, and anybody that spends just a few minutes doing a few Google searches will quickly start to understand when it comes to violent crime in America and homicides that there are distinct patterns when you look at racial groups and male versus female. There's distinct patterns. Those patterns go back a long time. That's not something new. So what's interesting is the students could probably find other patterns somewhere, but that particular pattern is pretty strong. So it's interesting that the idea of the pattern itself, it almost seems like they don't want to know about the pattern.
Or they want you to talk about, if you talk about the pattern, why that pattern exists.
Which is guessing.
So, but they want you to talk about over-policing. They want you to talk about structural bias that leads to the over-policing. It's a self-fulfilling circle and prophecy, et cetera, et cetera. And you're right, I'm not a scholar on all of those things, but the context, if you don't come in to present that context and talk about those other things or have a whole bunch of disclaimers about every topic you take on, you can walk into a minefield.
It's not exactly a tough generation, in my humble opinion. They've got some toughness issues. Let me shift you into something, though, which is probably the most important reason we're talking today. I think I'll just bring up the fun example because it'll bring people right into where you are going. Again, it's like a derivative of the next step, which is the Tom Cruise movie. It's the pre-crime. And it's the sense that now take it to its natural conclusion or natural whatever, where governments, corporations, et cetera, they can know your thoughts. They can know your feelings. They can know your imagination. Wow. Okay, now we're talking liberty in our mind. And as you say, cognitive liberty. I will have to say, I probably have a bias here in the sense that I don't think there's any way, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that when these technologies are unleashed, there are plenty of people on this planet right now, perhaps they're on the front cover of Time magazine, I don't know, whatever, but they will take these technologies and they will use them to their dystopian end, guaranteed. There is no way around it, in my humble opinion. Once the Borg, whether it's the state or the corporation, is a hold of the information inside of our mind, I don't know what's left. I don't know what's left.
Yeah, I want to stay optimistic. It's hard for me to stay fully optimistic. But so first, let's contextualize what we're talking about here.
I'll let you define a little bit more the landscape.
Yeah. So there's this promising field for people who suffer from paralysis or epilepsy or neurodegenerative diseases, ALS, who no longer can communicate with the outside world or can no longer physically move parts of their body, to have implanted neurotechnology, implanted electrodes, which enable them to then communicate more directly. They can go brain to computer or brain to technology. And that's not what we're talking about here, because that's not something I think that's going to be used by everyday people for interacting with technology or everything else. What we're talking about here is wearable brain sensors that are not unlike the sensors that people have in their smartwatches that pick up their heart rate, or Fitbits that pick up the number of steps they take, or rings that pick up their temperature or sleep patterns. But these are small electrodes, and there's different modalities of this, but we'll talk about the electrodes. So they're small electrodes that can be put into earbuds or headphones, worn as small wearable tattoos behind the ears, and they pick up brain activity, much like heart rate. But the difference, and the fundamental important difference, is brain activity reflects something quite different than just the functioning of our heart. It reflects the functioning of our brains, and the functioning of our brains are everything from our feelings to our anxieties to our biases and even our thoughts, although most of this technology can't pick up anything close to complex thoughts. It picks up brain states. And so what that means is that as this technology, which already exists and starting this spring is going to be launched into these multifunctional devices, like I said, the earbuds and the headphones, as that technology hits the market, suddenly, whether you're bored or engaged or frustrated, happy or sad, can be detected through algorithms, AI, that interprets what those signals of electrical activity in the brain mean that are being picked up by these devices. The initial launching of these is primarily focused on either brain health and wellness or simple tasks like meditating or honing your focus or neurogaming, different ways that you can play video games by moving a block around the screen by thinking about it or by focusing and getting your brain state into a state of focus or calm or relax. You can move your character through the screen. My fear with this technology is that because it can be used much more directly and for what you're feeling or what your brain states are, that very quickly corporations are going to commodify that data and that governments will use it and already are in the instances where they have deployed it to do things like interrogate a person's brain for if they committed a crime or interrogate a person's brain for what their political beliefs and biases are. And so our freedom of thought is at risk. And that's in a context and in a world in which all kinds of censoring and canceling of speech has already occurred. And so what keeps people from going to that next step? It's just been that they can't. And now that they can, I worry about what that means.
In the current world that's unfolding, my mind is looking more and more like Genghis Khan's nephew or something. They look inside my mind, they're going to be like, okay, take him away fast. Just put him away. Get him off the playing field. He's a bad one. Let me ask you this in terms of the way you see technology unfolding. I think people are familiar with seeing some of the street scenes, let's say in Beijing, China, and it looks like a grid and each person is identified by a camera. Chinese government knows exactly who everyone is. Will the technology eventually move to that? Meaning, will it have to be something below your ear, or will it be a big sensor up in the sky that can just pull this stuff out of your system, so to speak, without your permission?
Not electrical signals from your brain. There's way too much interference, meaning the everyday, whether it's your cell phone or whether it's any number of radio frequencies that exist, cell towers, all of the other electrical interference that exists would prevent electrical activity from being able to be monitored remotely in that way. There are other technologies which I also think would be very difficult, other than you might be able to move a few inches off the skin using something like functional near infrared imaging, where you have an infrared light that goes through a person's skull, through their brain, and is picked up at the other end about how the light goes through the tissue. But even that's really hard to do at any remote distance. It isn't inconceivable. And of course, there's been research into whether it has already happened, the possibility of using remote technologies to disrupt a person's brain. So Havana syndrome was being examined for a while as to whether there was some electromagnetic radiation.
It was crickets, right?
Yeah, well, that was one of the theories early on.
I think it came out, though. It was bugs at the end of the day.
I don't think that they've said what it is. I think just in the past month, the intelligence community came out and said, we don't think it was a foreign adversary who did it. But along the way, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine had issued a report saying that they did think it was some electromagnetic radiation or microwave. There were studies done on some of the people who suffered from it and found that there was some brain differences between them. But at the end of the day, that one has been largely written off. Moscow signal has not been, where Moscow signal actually did cause long-term radiation effects on people as the radiation was being beamed at people's bodies and during the Cold War. The point is, research continues on that front. Right now, the U.S. is funding research on ferrets of putting electromagnetic radiation and seeing whether they can replicate the Havana syndrome effects. And so I think theoretically, my point is, it's possible to imagine a world in which some kinds of remote disruption from the brain are possible. I think it's very difficult to imagine a world in which remote monitoring of the brain is possible unless somebody has something either touching their scalp or inside their brains.
Well, let me take it a step further. I can imagine. So we know in the criminal law system, they have ways to monitor people, ankle bracelets and these types of things. I could easily imagine enterprising politicians in the future figuring out a way to perhaps legally mandate that some people that don't obey the Borg and don't obey what they're supposed to do, and perhaps they say the wrong things or this or that, perhaps they find themselves in a pinch. And the plea down is, oh, we'll let you out of the felony charge. You can get the misdemeanor, but you've got to wear the earbuds.
It's amazing because every time I talk to somebody, they go even more dystopian than I do.
But hold on, that's not so dystopian. You're a criminal law.
No, it is pretty dystopian. I mean, I hadn't thought of that one.
Look, you're a criminal law professor, and you know damn well that a lot of prosecutors in this country, and I don't want to say too much about the specifics of something that I experienced as a teenager, but I saw very early on in this world how an enterprising prosecutor will overcharge because they know they're going to bring it down.
I'm not saying it's impossible. I just mean that I think of terrible applications of this technology, mostly rooted in what's already happening. And then when I talk with somebody, they come up with something even worse that makes me even more scared about it. But no, you're right. That's not an impossible thing to imagine. There have been not just ankle bracelets, but there have been medical interventions like you want a sentencing reduction, then you have to take Depo-Provera or something, or some drug of chemical castration to make us more confident that you're not going to offend again. There have been scholars who've written about this idea of maybe moral enhancement could be a sentencing alternative where you're talking not just about monitoring brains, but hacking and reconditioning the brain. You're going to get an electrical shock every time you think about something that's bad. So people have thought about this. I think it is theoretically possible. I hope we don't go there, but you're right, which is it's theoretically possible.
Let me flip it around on you. What if in the future, as we go down this path, that the enterprising leader says to the people, hey, if we all wear our earbuds, we will have greater protection because if we're all wearing the earbuds, we can detect when XYZ criminals' brainwaves are showing us the pattern that he's about to start pulling the trigger.
If we get to the point where we actually know what that looks like, I think.
But you're theorizing it's on the plate. You're putting us in the mindset to imagine the possibilities, aren't you?
Yeah, I think if you had wide scale monitoring of brains and we knew what brainwave activity looked like before somebody pulled the trigger of a gun, and that somehow was distinct and different if you're pulling the trigger of a video game gun versus a real gun, that was a neural signature that you could pick up. I think it's hard to imagine that we could really figure out that neural signature to that precision. But if we did, maybe. I'll give you a more realistic, I think, possibility, which is there's a researcher who, for a long time, has studied the neural correlates of psychopathy. He has administered the test, the written test, to a number of people who are already in prison. Then those who score high enough to be considered, they satisfy the scoring for psychopathy. He's then done functional magnetic resonance imaging of their brains and looked at both people who score satisfy versus control groups that don't. And he's found differences in the brains of people who are psychopaths versus people who are not. Some of his other research shows that you can see some of those differences in the brain as early as 5 years old. And he hasn't followed those kids from 5 years old to adulthood to see if those neural correlates then play out into actually doing criminal misconduct. That predisposition to violent crime or predisposition to antisocial personality, that's the thing that I worry more about the use of this technology by governments. Predispositions to violence and using that as a justification for long-term surveillance or diversion or segregating those people and discriminating against them in society. I think it's more likely that we could pick up the neural correlates of predispositions than of a likelihood of pulling the trigger of a gun.
Let me shift it to another issue in this world. IQ. Let's imagine we get to the place where we've got the earbuds going. I can imagine a situation where perhaps there's measurements of the capacity of particular minds. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It depends on who has the information, who has the data, and what they might do with it. which is a big question of your particular book here.
I think that's right. What can we learn? How will it be used and how it will be misused? And it's already being used in education. So I'll back up for my cue to say a simpler measure today that we can already do is if somebody's paying attention or their mind is wandering. Some people can focus for very long periods of time, and some people can only focus for very short periods of time. An education setting that can correlate to how well they perform in the classroom. And so already in classrooms in China, students have been required to wear these headsets that track their brain activity to see whether or not they're paying attention or their mind is wandering. And those same headsets have been used in classrooms and in large scale studies in many classrooms across the world to see if you can pick up information about how well students are able to pay attention or their mind is wandering, or whether meditation can lead to decreases in the number of children who are referred for disciplinary problems to the principal's office. Those kinds of measures right now, at least in the non-China context, have primarily been used to try to help students improve their focus or their learning or decrease their stress levels and increase their ability to conform their conduct what's required of them in the classroom. But you can see how that very quickly can go dystopian if it's used to segregate or discriminate against students or in the classrooms in China where it already is.
I'll bring up the example of me and you right now. Here we are, we're doing a podcast. If we want this podcast to shine, you and I have to give it our all, so to speak. We can't just drift off or it won't work or people won't pay attention. But you know this, I know this, that if we sit here for an hour and we communicate and we are rapt attention, the calories that are being burned in our minds, the adrenaline that's picking up, the state that we will be in when we finish is completely different. What's interesting about this idea of monitoring brain activity is then you've got to take a step back and say, well, hold on, everyone's got to figure out a way to manage their own activity in their mind because there's a calorie thing going on here too. I can see the dystopian part of let's just manage all activity in all minds. You bring up some issues that are, oh, wow. Fun. Not fun, not fun. Let me take you back a step, though. Since you're on the campus these days, when it comes to liberty, and here you are, you're teaching, this is a word topic, very important to you. What have you observed from your perspective that's bothered you the most? Beyond even diving into the battle for inside our brain, just liberty in general, what has bothered you the most in the last 5 or 6 years? I think that's been the real hotbed of things ratcheting up. What has bothered you the most about losses of liberty that you have seen?
I think what bothers me the most is intolerance to hear different viewpoints. The fact that civil discourse has just, in so many ways, collapsed. And that bothers me the most, especially from an educational perspective. If students are only hearing or learning one perspective, how do they ever learn how to counter alternative viewpoints or truly figure out what their own perspective is without actually encountering a diversity of ideas that they can grapple with and think about and reject some and integrate others and learn what true debate looks like, what civil engagement with differing viewpoints looks like. I think that that's been the most discouraging to me, is to see the most conversations are happening in silos within personal echo chambers rather than actual engagement with ideas. And as a professor, as an educator, I live in the world of ideas. I love ideas. That's why I'm an academic. And to be in a world where it's getting narrower and narrower, the ability to truly engage a diversity of viewpoints, or even just the idea of being a professor and being the devil's advocate to make sure a different perspective is heard in the classroom, that's something that's dangerous to do now rather than encouraged. As an educator, I think that's the thing that has made me the most nervous. Other thing I could say, if I step back from the educational institution and just look at the world, it's the world in which people don't even engage at all. If you've walked through an airport recently, you'll notice that you'll run into people who are glued to their phones and don't even realize that there is a world around them. That worries me a lot too, is the disengagement from the real world as people get sucked into addictive digital worlds.
You might not like this descriptor, but since you have been very forcefully saying in this conversation that you like the idea of different thoughts being put out there, and we can agree to disagree, but so you might not like this descriptor that I'm going to use. I don't know everything about you. I don't know all about your politics or this or that, but I think I can safely say that you are not a woke professor. You are not woke. What will we get to in the future if we do have professors that are speaking like you're speaking with a curious mind, an open landscape, and engagement back and forth? What will we get to in the future when you retire or move on and the professors become some of these kids today that are woke, frankly?
I will tell you that I don't honestly know what that word means. And I say that just because it's been used so much in media and in other ways.
And my description would just be we're having this conversation about ideas and we're having this conversation about philosophies and things that might happen. And I see there's an entire grouping of people around the planet right now that are not interested in that. What they're interested in, please, and they're just ask me how I feel. I want to tell you how I feel. Everything is about how I feel, how I feel. I would say that for me, Mike's definition is that goes the woke direction. When we lose the concept of ideas and we're just talking about somebody's subjective feelings.
I'd say my viewpoint, however we want to stereotype it, is maybe a generational divide at this point. The next generation has expressed that there are certain viewpoints that just should not be heard, that should not be aired, that they do such violence to them physically or emotionally that it's not that a diversity of ideas help. There are certain ideas that should just be silenced. And that's not my perspective. It's not my perspective because I think there are better ways to counter ideas that people disagree with than silencing them. And I think that where that goes and the tyranny of the majority that that introduces and the silencing of thought and the inability for people to truly learn how to counter ideas or what alternative ideas are or debate are, I think that's problematic. If that becomes the future of society, I worry about what that means. Have you ever seen these book series? It's called The Sad Little Facts. There are these children books. The idea is there are these little facts that are going around in the world, and there are these little characters in a children's book. And the true facts all get buried deep under the ground. And all of the bad facts are the ones that are above ground and celebrating. And society goes about only interacting with bad facts because all of the good facts have been buried deep underground. And then one day society wakes up and they wonder what happened to all of the real facts. And they go hunting and they discover them deep underground and they resurface them again. I like that book. And I like that book not because of the interim where all of the sad little facts are buried deep underground, but I think there is a danger when you bury voices, when you silence them, that we will end up with a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and untrue facts that are dominating the world, and that you don't have any of the true facts to counter that. I hope that what happens instead of the next generation just continuing to keep them underground is that the pendulum comes back and that it levels out where we actually have a diversity of viewpoints that are celebrated as the way we reach truth and engagement and counter disinformation and misinformation in the world.
I just can't imagine with some of the clips that I see and some of the videos that I see and whatnot, some of the perspectives that, let's say, college age folks are taking right now. I just can't imagine that they hear you say what you're saying, which sounds just perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational. I can't imagine, though, that they like it because they know that if they agree to the way that you are talking, then they know they can't shut things down. So if they agree to your perspectives, they lose power, the power that I see some of the younger generation wielding right now, which is just, hey, we don't like that. Let's shut it down.
So, what I imagine will happen is you think what I'm saying is reasonable. Let's assume you're right. College age students don't. Increasingly, we might see more and more extremism in that regard. What becomes reasonable shifts farther and farther and farther so that there's only a very small set of views that can be expressed. If that happens, the majority, I think, swings back the other direction and says, wait a minute, the tyranny of voices that are happening here is not actually beneficial for human flourishing. Human flourishing requires that we actually have freedom of thought and ideas and engagement with a broad set of viewpoints. And maybe that's a naive optimism on my part. And maybe there is a difficult period in which we do end up with the tyranny of voices. But I think my worry is that who decides what gets heard and what doesn't get heard can just be so deeply problematic and controlled. Going back to the earlier part of our conversation, if the government is choosing who gets heard on Facebook and who doesn't, or if on TikTok you have government intervention about which videos go viral and which videos don't go viral, it's easy to shape views. It's easy to run ideological warfare on people so that only a particular view gets heard and amplified. And that doesn't help us as humans. That doesn't help us actually flourish with a diversity of perspectives. I think the ease with which that kind of a system can be abused ends up hopefully eventually leading to a pushback against it. You're seeing it with the banning of books and the burning of books. I thought that was an old generation thing. I didn't think we would see banning of books in schools happening on viewpoints, but that's happening and that's nuts.
The problem with pushback is that if you try to push back in this current climate, you can be canceled. You can be taken off the board. I think a couple of years ago, people would have said, oh, no, Mike, you're just exaggerating a little bit. No, I'm not. That's exactly what's happening right now. A ton of reasonable people have been taken off the board because their political opinions were not correct.
I think one of the benefits I have to make it less likely, and who knows, maybe after this conversation, I'll be canceled and that will be that. But I think one of the benefits I have is that I'm saying this, but I'm not also offering extreme views. A lot of the people who have been saying don't cancel viewpoints also have views that are perceived to be extreme views. So the thing that I'm saying, which is we ought to have a diversity of viewpoints, isn't coupled with me also having racist or misogynistic or other kinds of views that I also am professing. So the combination of the two makes maybe the messenger a little bit easier to hear because I'm not saying it so that I can advance a bunch of extreme views. I'm saying it because I think that freedom of thought is necessary and that we ought to be safeguarding freedom of thought and cognitive liberty. So it's saying it and having a message that I think isn't one that is likely to be rejected by the very people who are engaged in canceling.
We might have to agree to disagree on that one. Because
okay.
You're giving those rabble rousers out there, or maybe they're not rabble rousers. Maybe they just have a controversial opinion. Maybe they don't think their opinion's controversial. But even though you are very reasonably laying out, which is just a very traditional American perspective when it comes to law and freedom of speech, et cetera, the people today that want to regulate speech, I mean, look, you're a nice person, so maybe they won't come after you.
Well, I mean, so for example, where do you come out on censorship on platforms? So we started with Facebook canceling you. What about extreme hate and other speech that shows up on those platforms? Should there be any censoring of it?
Well, here's the problem. I don't know what extreme hate means. There's some lollipops out there that would say it's like the classic Seinfeld episode where the girl has an ice cream cone that falls on the ground. She starts crying. I think you have to stick with the founding principles. You know this more than me. We've had all kinds of Supreme Court case law over freedom of speech. These foundations were laid, and now it seems like we're trying to rewrite them in real time based on people's feelings. So it's all frightening to me. The flip side, back to your point, saying, hey, Mike, okay, maybe you were censored from Facebook. Was it the government or was it Facebook? Here's the problem right there. We have no earthly idea what the chain of command is. We have some indication on Twitter. We have no earthly idea what's going on with Google or Facebook or anything. We don't know how many different governments, how many different agencies have got a pipeline into the person with the delete button. We don't know. And that's frightening.
No, I agree. I think as the tech titans increase their power, as there is increasing government engagement and intervention and backdoors that are given to government and all of it, I worry about both corporate and government. My book, The Battle for Your Brain, doesn't just take issue with government intervention with freedom of thought. It does a deep dive into the use of neurotechnology and technologies in the workplace for surveillance, or the use of technologies to addict people or to try to overcome their ability to act otherwise and to free themselves of the different systems and platforms with features and technology, or incubation of dreams and issues like that. It's pretty wide scale for the number of areas that I think we have threats.
You got me thinking. There's no doubt you put a massive fund on the table. Thinking people will start thinking more.
I hope that thinking people start thinking more, and I hope people really consider this last bastion of freedom, because as we've been talking about, the ability to talk freely, at least in today's age, no longer exists. So, the one space people have for mental reprieve, the one space that they have to truly be able to think freely is in their minds. And as we hook up our brains to AI and to exposure to the rest of the world, there is promise for that technology, but there's also a significant risk that what we see in society generally when it comes to freedom of speech will hit freedom of thought. Even the ability to think freely will be compromised.
The book, The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. Need a fun conversation. Please keep me posted on future books. I'd always love to talk to you. You're a great conversation. Hey, is there a place that you might want to direct people to? The book will be available on all those fun places, but is there a website you want to direct people to?
Yes, please go to nitafarahany.com where they can learn more about the book, what I'm up to, and also sign up for my Substack, Thinking Freely.
Nita, cool stuff. I hope you enjoyed my banter and my probing.
I very much did. It was a lot of fun.
Nita, you take care.
You too. Thanks so much for the conversation.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.